Trials and Tribulations, where we break down the latest FDA revelations. DAPs, that's the talk of the day. Diversity action plans paving the way. Diversity of trials, that's what we preach. Inclusivity for all, it's within our reach. FDA's draft, we're breaking it down. All diversity trials, the best part around. FDA, please, we need the shift. Diversity in trials, let's uplift. DAP, yeah, you know me. Inclusivity for all, it's the key. Diversity in trials, that's what we preach. Inclusivity for all, it's within our reach. FDA's draft, we're breaking it down. All diversity trials, the best part around. So tune in live and join the ride. DiversiTrials and Tribulations, let's spread it wide. With DAPs, we're forging the path. Together in research, let's make it last. Diversity.
Hey, that was a lot going on right there.
That's okay. That's okay. It looks great, Mitch. Great job.
I do what I can. That's what I'm here for. Happy Friday,
welcome.
Everyone. Yeah.
Happy Friday. I've got an announcement for everyone, just so you know. A few months back, Brad Hightower and I interviewed a terminal cancer patient and his wife. That terminal cancer patient did end up passing away this week. So my biggest condolences out to Jake and Jake's family. And I guess one thing that I really want to remind everyone of is people are dying every day. And that's why we're here. We're not just a bunch of YouTubers trying to get fame. People are really dying. And as many people as you see die, I would strongly encourage you not to stop feeling that. I know it's easy to harden, you got to compartmentalize it. You got to move forward, but don't forget why you're here and don't forget the impact of what we are doing right now. So I'm admittedly kind of down. These sections are going to pretty much neuter the guidance, and I'm looking forward to talking about it. So happy DiversiTrials, everyone. Happy Friday.
No, well said, man. Well said. And it's a good thing to remember. I mean, it's kind of like maintaining your why, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing, Daniel.
Yep. Just got to have a little bit of a ground. So welcome to DiversiTrials and Tribulations. This podcast series is dedicated to dissecting the FDA Diversity Action Plan draft guidance so we can put some comments together, put our notes into the FDA so they can listen to this community and we can have a voice in how this DAP is developing. We're going to go into the SWOT from last time real quick, but before I do, I have to say, everyone, this section 7 is one of the most important sections in the guidance. If you don't read any of it, actually, you would have to read all of it to understand how important this section 7 is, but do not take this section lightly. This is far more than just a procedure, and we'll get to that. But let's go over the SWOT from last time. So we still have 3 people. Got to do this. Oh, all right. So
there you go.
Hadi, you've never gotten to do the strengths. You willing to do the strengths?
Sure. There's a lot to be said here. So first of all, it gets a little legally with the terms that they use, like must and should and may and statutory, so to establish serious considerations for DAPs and enrollment goals. This can be a little confusing to the reader, to be honest with you. I mean, I had to actually read it a few times before I really got a grasp of what they really mean. So just like, as a just wanted to clarify that these can be a little confusing, right, to the reader. So as you said, section B can be a little straightforward and directive. So the lines between the lines 378 and 381, we actually one of our guests who joined our podcast a couple of weeks ago had a great shout out in regards to the skin pigmentation. That was a big win. An explanation to provide impactful validation. So yes, that was really a good example that we liked a lot, and it actually resonated with us a lot. So that was really a good strength. And then between the line 391 and 396, the FDA established an expected scope and focus of this guidance specific to DAPs, not broader healthcare inequities. So this, in our opinion, is a strength, and that should be maintained moving forward. Between the line 403 and 408, the recommendation for cultural competency and proficiency training, we kept on preaching about cultural competency and sensitivity training. The way I call it, this is something very clear over there, and it's actually a strength that we consider as a very, very strong strength that need to be highlighted. Lines 400 to 402, community engagement, advisory boards by sponsors. This should be really highlighted more and get community, sustainable community programs ongoing, and then we need to actually get the patient's voice, like the advisory, whether it's advisory boards or patient advocacy groups. We need to probably highlight the need and the importance of getting those groups engaged with this DAP or early designs. And as Mitch always preaches, early design is really a great thing to really focus on. Between the lines 400 and 421, the measures. So between the lines 400 and 421, measures are broad and encompassing of all trial types. We consider that to be a strength. And finally, the DAP is a fluid document capable of modifications and submissions, and that was actually reflected between the lines 422 and 429, because that was clearly answered and presented in those slides, because we had an earlier question mark about how fluid this document should be or is. So we had our answer in those between the lines 422 and 429. So this is a fluid document, able, or at least they welcome modifications and revisions as we go along, and that should be probably made more clear, which is actually in section 7.
Great follow-up, Hadi. Those answers were given in this one in the procedures. Ironically, it's kind of odd, but an interesting.
And then in section 7, they talk about how modifications can be or revisions can be submitted. So
they spell it out very well. And
right.
So I get it. When it comes to pieces of information, it's really hard to bin it when these outlines. So some of them might seem out of place, but I'm sure that they made sense to the people who organized the document.
Right. Yeah. As always, if you're the one making it, it makes sense. But
yeah. So I'll go for weaknesses. I've never gotten to do weaknesses. This is interesting because it's like all the complaints, right? All right. So section B didn't really add a whole lot of information, detail, or clarification compared to the past sections. It just felt like a rendition. I didn't really feel, or we didn't really feel there's a whole lot more that was contributed to the idea that wasn't already mentioned. Lines 343 and 346, several studies to single marketing submissions. It was kind of confusing in a format, and it may require additional detail. And by the way, Hadi, this is going to come up with a vengeance on this section 7. Line number 400, engagement. The trigger word, not a big fan. It's often perceived as transactional. People feel intimidated or abused with this terminology. Here's my soapbox. I won't go too far into it, but the industry does not, quote, employ lines 412, 421 research sites, but rather establishes contracts with individual contractors. Further, every agreement signed between sites and sponsors agrees the site is not an employee of the sponsor. Line number 421, clarification for decentralized methods that are specific to DAP utility are not included. There's just one line. Let's just add it at the bottom, DCT, but there's really nothing about there. There is a footnote, and that's kind of an irony that we'll go into. But line number 400 and 421, examples are blurred with strategies that sponsors can and cannot, may or may not, whatever it might be, control when they work with independent contracted research sites. While sponsors can influence protocol development, funding, and site selection, they are not legally or ethically capable of site activities such as trial participant engagement. You're not really supposed to do that, sponsors. And FDA, that's the rule. Allowing flexible hours for study visits. Sponsors don't control study visits. That's why sites are performing the trial. And finally, the utilization of decentralized tools, which, by the way, that is a site selection, just like home health or whatever it might be. So maybe you could put in there something about work with sites to offer, but you can't really control those factors of the trial.
Yeah.
Mitch, want to hand it off to opportunities?
Absolutely. And as always, these opportunities often feed directly off of the weaknesses. So kicking it off with, again, we're going to dive a lot into this for section 7, but clarifying with additional detail what those single marketing submissions comprising of several studies should look like. There wasn't a whole lot of transparency there or clearance or guidance. Maintaining consistent terminology with section 5A's table, if we want to call it a table, with terms like genetic variations. And then, again, from the weaknesses as well as replacing engagement with something that, I know Hadi is like talking about more sustained community trust initiatives. And I always use the term unconditional community engagement because that's really what the implication was for that section. But we don't want it to get lost in translation as well. Providing additional details into collaboration with advocacy groups and patients. And we think there's a good opportunity there to maybe provide a little clarity or maybe some additional guidance on what that might look like. They do a good job in a lot of these sections of providing like examples, and that seems like a place where there's an opportunity to provide some examples of what that may be. So additional details of how DCT technologies may assist with DAP requirements. They do reference like in footnotes, essentially like DCTs when they do talk about implementing DCTs as a strategy to reduce patient burden and things like that as well. But it's always good, as we talked about in previous ones, where if you have an opportunity to clarify what it is specifically you want or what that guidance or expectations are in this document, you should do it in this document and not just reference several other documents. And then 411 to 415, when it talks about reducing patient burden, I think more so is just making sure that, while that's potentially fantastic as a DAP strategy, we were all on the same page, and I think a lot of us in the industry are on the same page of, that should be across the board strategies and not just something that you're trying to apply because of DAP. The DAP requirements, just make things easier for patients across the board would be good. Clarifying the sponsor's role and authority in implementation of cultural competency training. We talked heavily about this and, really whose responsibility that should be. I know there's going to be tons of different floating ideas around this, but it would be great to see what the FDA's expectations are, and at least those expectations of how the sponsor should clarify what it expects from sites, whether it's complying with their requirements or to bring their own. And then recognizing clinical research sites as stakeholders in the enrollment and retention strategies, and separate sponsor examples from site examples.
Yep. And I think that goes back to one of the first videos we had where even if you go to make a response to the FDA, clinical research site isn't even on their list of stakeholders.
Yeah.
So that might be something we really need to maybe have a conversation about. They don't even realize it.
Yeah.
Hadi, you want to
Yeah,
button
of
it up with
course.
threats?
Of course. Thank you. So lines 353 to 355, continuing observation with required inclusion of PK and PD, safety, and or effectiveness. So a DAP is not a process to be submitted at phase 3 of a medical product's lifestyle. It should be actually considered at phase 0. And this is
This
actually
section. Yep.
and at section 6, alluded to some of this as well. And this is something that, I was a little, it's a threat, it is a big threat that we need to actually be very clear about when is that required. Exactly. It's like, there's a gray area. You can submit it at IND, but no later than, phase 3. It's like, what? But anyway, moving forward, enrollment retention, and that was actually reflected in lines 389, 395, 398, and 399. They defined as recruiting trial participants and keeping them on the study are the sole responsibilities of clinical research sites, not sponsors. So again, I mean, they make it clear, they make it sound like the sponsor is like, doing that, and they employ sites. And again, we're going back to the same language, which is we consider this to be a threat. So this is like, the responsibility of the research sites, not sponsors, and the descriptions may therefore cause confusion into what sponsors should and should not have oversight into, and compromise industry processes and understandings of roles and responsibilities. So we wanted to highlight these 2 big points under threats, and thank you guys so much for putting this together.
Yep. And
Yeah.
to address anyone out there, any of the critics out there saying, oh, well, you're just trying to protect the job security of the sites, I strongly encourage you to look at GCP, read a CTA, and fully understand what we're talking about here. There are ethical boundaries that should not be dropped when it comes to this. Safety and security are in place, and FDA, I get it. You're working directly with the sponsor, but understand the workflow and why it's like that for a reason. All right, we are already 17 minutes in. This is a huge section. Let's jump right into it. Let's get Mitch and Hadi to say something while I'm switching screens. Just go ahead and let's talk about something.
So as per the past, I'm posting in another link. It should already be on LinkedIn. However, it's now available for the YouTube viewers as well. So there's a link to the PDF. It's a collaborative document. We want people to get in and come and engage. They're going to stay open. I don't have like a specific cutoff date for these. So, as we're working up to wrapping up this entire series and working with, the community on explaining how you would get in and how you post comments, we're going to be getting back into all of these shared PDFs and pulling everyone's comments and feedback and reviewing it all at the end as well. So it's never too late to get in and add comments.
And so I'm huge on community outreach, community advocacy, community voice. Just know that all of these are coming together to create a response letter to the FDA as a community response letter. If you would like to be a part of this, help to contribute it, help to format it, if you would like to learn how to write a letter to the FDA, please reach out. We'd love to look for volunteers to work with us, collaborate, help us write and compile. And this is a community effort, so we could really use your help.
Yeah.
So general outline of everything we're going to talk today. There's section 6, timelines for submitting diversity action plans. Super short. I don't expect a lot of time on it. There are a couple pertinent things that we want to talk about, but we're going to spend most of our time in section 7, procedures for submitting the diversity action plan and receiving feedback. Don't let the name of this section fool you. This is actually like section 5D. There's a ton of stuff in here that includes content in your diversity action plan. And as a result, we do have at the end, if you look at the end of the diversity action plan, there is an appendices, elements of diversity action plans. This is the summary. this is your outline. Challenge to anyone out there listening, try writing a diversity action plan using this outline. See how it feels for you. Understand the approach, see what you can work with it. I think we might be touching on this here in a little bit. But before we start, I thought this was really funny, everyone. And so lines number 470 and 472. I always like to start with humor, especially in sections that might be a little rough. 470 to 472. I wonder if maybe some of the authors of the diversity guidance should be reading this. So it says, to ensure that FDA can conduct a timely and efficient review of the diversity action plan. In other words, so we can be more efficient and quick, sponsors should describe the required elements of the diversity action plan clearly and concisely with limited cross-referencing
Yeah.
previously submitted documents.
You
Yeah.
know,
FDA does not want footnotes, everyone, in their diversity action plans.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the irony of that. I mean, footnote to a footnote. We don't want a footnote to a footnote. Clear,
Right.
concise, keep it. We don't want to have to look at any other documents. We want this to be a freestanding document.
It gets better too, like when you even talk about like post marketing and everything.
Oh
as well.
yeah.
And
Oh yeah.
this comes up again by you're expected to and required to kind of cross reference some of those other previously submitted documents or approvals or waivers or whatever.
So I highlighted this and I wrote funny.
Nice.
It's very, very funny. All right, we actually have a comment. So, Rosemary, thanks so much, Daniel, Dr. Nawi, and Mitch for your thoughts, analysis, and summary of the DAP. Can you share the graphic? Rosemary, it is all over LinkedIn. DiversiTrials posted it this morning. The graphic is public and ready and available. And as we discuss, if anyone has access to that link for that post, if you're willing to post it for Rosemary, we want to make sure that you have everything that you need.
Yep. We actually have.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have SWOT analyses that look like that for all sections through section 5 at this point. Some have been combined, like this section coming up is going to be 6 and 7. So we'll have another one next week for 6 and 7 as well.
And be prepared at the end. If you want to just wait for all the highlights, we're going to have one of those for every single section. Okay, so let's start with section number 6. Again, I don't anticipate a lot of time on this, but what are your initial thoughts?
So we just finished up the SWOT from section 5, B and C. And in the threats for section 5, it talks directly about this, right? So we're getting hit with it right away as far as what those timelines are. You know, as soon as practicable. But again, it's right there with no later than for phase 3 or as appropriate other pivotal study, which again, as we mentioned, I think in previous DAPs, previous DAP SWOT analyses, it's really, pivotal is all perspective.
How you define that?
Right. It's perspective. So
yeah. So another community challenge for anyone out there who's keeping tabs. Line number 435. As soon as practicable, read between the lines, everyone. This is not a phase 3 thing. This is like FDA had to do a statutory deadline. Yeah. But it might be good for them to state, if you wait until phase 3, odds are you're probably way too late, to be honest. Yeah. You would have probably had to go back and redo your entire trial. It is in your best financial interest to create the DAP with intention all the way back to phase 0, all the way back to planning. And FDA just continually says that in every single section.
If you're not early, you're late.
Right. And then, it's like, I'm not really a fan of the use of these words, as soon as practicable. It's like, it's open to interpretation. And it's like,
there's a lot of interpretation here. Yeah. The other one is because FDA's review of and feedback on the diversity action plan is most efficient if it occurs in the context of discussions regarding trial design, study population selection, and other aspects. FDA recommends submission of the diversity action plan when a sponsor is seeking feedback regarding the applicable clinical study for the drug, typically at the end of phase 2 meeting.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah, I think phase 3 is pretty misleading. And I know
well,
that everyone drew to that, but read between the lines, folks. That's
the
not going to work.
importance here, like when you really start looking from, you know, even that sponsor's perspective, you know, at least the way that I would take it, you know, from previous sponsor experience, is when we spoke previously about the guidance and what the expectations were on how you have to build out your guidance, right, and what data you're using to, you know, build these references. If you didn't put in the work as a program for a whole ClinOps program for a study or for a drug or an entire therapeutic area, if you will, to collect that phase 1, you know, that safety, efficacy, and the tolerability data, then you don't have that by the time you get here. You know what I mean? So the more work you do ahead of time should make your DAPs so much easier to work with, because you're coming in with quality data. So you can actually have a DAP that makes sense instead of like, well, we have no clue, but this is what we're going to try to do.
Yeah. So maybe that's the community challenge. How many times in this guidance was it highly, strongly, super duper encouraged, recommended that this is performed much earlier than phase 3?
Right.
I think every single section kind of alludes to that.
Right.
Help yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, right. And then, you know, the other point that I wanted to point out here, or, you know, highlight is, you know, when a sponsor is seeking feedback. Okay, so they kept, I mean, you know, with the following section and all, they kept on saying, like, you know, the sponsor may or may not, you know, ask for
That was
feedback.
one of mine
And
too.
it's like, who in their right mind, you know, like why would I actually, if I'm a sponsor, if I were a sponsor, why would I actually ask for feedback and ask for more work if I'm not really, you know, if I don't really have to do that? So it's really very, you know, unenforceable in some ways. And if I were a sponsor, I wouldn't probably follow through.
I think, and that's in section 7, we're going to jump into that. Just to wrap up the timeline, if it's okay, we're back in device world for this last paragraph.
Yep.
And again, admittedly, I am not super expert in devices. However, if I were in devices right now, I would be freaking out because I have no idea what the FDA's expectations are. Well, you should do it for this, but not for that. But you might want to do it for this, but we're always happy to take an application, but we don't want to see all of your applications. And so you remember the last section, it was FDA doesn't have to look at all these things for devices. There are certain situations where they're not. But at the very end, it says, let's see, the IDE application or prior initiating what is it? FDA may review pre-submission. You know, it talks about IND applications going through the queue submissions. We're going to start going about annual reviews here in a minute. But I've listened to this so many times right now, and I think I'm just going to have to do a do or do not specifically for devices. But even when I do that, I still think it's going to get confusing.
It may be. I do like this last sentence of the section, because again, it kind of supports that previous reach out, ask questions, get help with, you know, your ICHE8, quality by design. You know, a sponsor may include those questions regarding the DAP in queue submissions to request feedback on questions related to design and conduct of a clinical study prior to submission. Yes, please do.
Yes. So this is kind of like the FDA's way of saying, hey, this may be a challenge, but we're here for you. You know, you're not doing this alone. We're here to work with you. So I do appreciate them kind of doing that olive branch there, just saying this is we'll get through this. And then section 7 happened. So, okay, section 7, really quick, dissect it down. You have a brief intro, this giant thing that says 4 drugs with it's pretty straightforward, but then it says 4 devices and it just keeps going. So devices is really, really dissected out. Nothing at the end to wrap it up. It's either just drugs or devices and then we're done. Let's start at the top. So what are your initial thoughts on section 7? Hadi, do you want to go first? You want to go through your comments?
Sure. So this is what I wanted to actually highlight on in lines 470, 470, and 471. Again, we talked about the cross-referencing, so we can move forward. I mean, I don't want to repeat well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I already had a comment there. But moving forwards, like again, there's this language gap. I mean, for me personally, I'm not an expert on devices either. That I found between the drugs. For drugs and for devices, but again, we can move forward slowly with this section. But I like the fact that they walked the reader through the sections and how the DAP should be submitted with the title and all, and whether it's a revised or initial or original plan submitted for review. What I wanted to actually highlight here is that between the lines 489 and 491, depending on the specifics for each clinical development program, the relevant division, and C there and C bear,
Yeah, we may or may not. Depends on how we
may
feel that
and may
day.
not
I don't
provide
know.
feedback on the diversity action plan. So if I submit a diversity action plan, if I were a sponsor and I submit, I mean, I was like, I'm a sponsor and I'm very proactive and I submitted this action plan. I would probably be anxious and wanting to find out, some feedback. So they may or may not. And then it's up to me to really go back and request feedback. And I mean, I'm just wondering how many sponsors would actually really be playing this game, or at least, investing time and energy in wanting to really ask specifically for feedback and really, have FDA on their back. You know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? So again, FDA feedback on a new or revised diversity action plan may be at FDA's initiative or per the sponsor specific request for feedback. Okay, so it's up in the air.
It's
They
loosey
might
goosey.
answer or
Yep.
may not. The sponsors may ask for requests or may not. It's like, what's going on here?
Yep.
Yeah, so
I
it's like,
so if I ever see the term may or may not, that's like a disclosure on something. That's not a guidance. It's like, we're kind of covering our butts. It should
yeah,
work or it might not. It
exactly.
might come from the FDA. It might come from the sponsor. I don't know. We'll just see. We'll roll the
Exactly.
dice
I
and
mean,
see
we're
what
just
happens.
doing it at. I mean, I'm glad we have this, time to really provide feedback, but it's like, it's actually creating more confusion and non-enforceable, action plans at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
I can say though that if you don't specifically ask for feedback, as it mentions, right, you can ask for feedback and then sure you're more likely to get it. But if you don't ask for feedback and you get some, you should probably implement that feedback.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
You want your
Historically
application.
speaking.
Yeah, but I
How do
mean,
you
we
want to
all
keep
know
going?
that FDA is understaffed, and the
Yeah.
backlog with FDA is like, are they really gonna look at those? I mean, I would like to see an act, not an advisory board, but at least some kind of an office within the FDA that is solely, created to review these diversity action plans and follow through with all of them. Whether this is like a realistic or not, am I dreaming? I mean, but I'd love to see this happen, and so that
It's
every
funny you should
sponsor
say
can
that,
take
Hadi,
it very
because
seriously.
when I read this section in particular, I sat here thinking, I totally want to work for the FDA right now because this is not good and I want it to be better. So maybe we can set up the FDA's Department of Diversity Action Plan
You
review.
know what, Dr. Fox? I swear to God, I was actually thinking of that last night. It's like, maybe we should propose something to the FDA so that we can actually take it over. And not take over, but at least help, or like, with the reviews and,
I'd love to help.
establish some kind of an office there, or a review, or like an external review board. I mean, whereby we can, be very proactive in terms of, reviewing all the diversity action plans and have a tool, have a rubric, and that will actually really get up and running very soon. We
Mhm.
can get it up and
I,
running very soon. But this is
I
really,
wouldn't.
we need to be proactive in this. And this is what we're doing basically. This is the crux of our discussion with all this podcast here. We need
Mhm.
to be proactive. We need to be very strong in trying to suggest that this is what we need, that this is what needs to be done, and we're here to help the FDA. Whether they're gonna take us up on that or not, it should be putting down, which should be put and writing down with our feedback back to the FDA.
So I would imagine, and I think that's a good point because it's not necessarily clear. I don't know that they need to make it clear on who's reviewing, but I would imagine, or at least like to think, that the review of, or feedback or comments to diversity action plans would be coming from like the FDA Office of Minority Health and Health Equity
And external advisory boards.
and external advisory board, sure. But I mean, that's the logical. You're not hitting like a field office for feedback. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So
how do you?
There
tell
should
you
be
what,
more processes about this.
let's do
write an
all
SOP.
drugs. Let's do the whole drug, and then we'll take turns on drugs, and then we'll shift over to devices because it's
Right.
a pretty distinct silo. So, did you have anything else on the drug section?
Yes. So lines 513, 514, 515, when they specifically say sponsors should submit the diversity action plan update in the annual report section pertaining
There
to
it
clinical
is.
study participant
There
demographic.
it is. Remember we talked about that, like an IRB review, IND review. There it is.
So if such goals are not on track for being met, I mean, again, so there should be some, clear procedures or processes with the interim reviews, feedback, and action plans, where, when, and where should be taking place before the end of any study. And I don't personally believe that studies should be approved with no completed diversity or inclusion goals.
So, Hadi, I'm really glad you said that because this is probably, admittedly, the section that broke my heart. All right. So in the very beginning, on line number 509, it said FDA regulations require IND sponsors to submit annual reports. Okay, we knew that. The annual reports must, remember the musts and shoulds of the world?
Right.
This is where it's going to really kick everyone. Must include each study with the total number of subjects entered into the study to date, tabulated by age group, gender, and race. Where did ethnicity go? That was up in section 5.
That's ethnicity went to among other information, which
It must
that's
have been among
okay.
other information.
And
Now,
that's exactly the point where we need to be consistent with the listing.
A couple things to note here. One is we don't want footnotes. That's a different author. No ethnicity. That's a different author. This is a totally different voice, and I can see why. Because remember must up at 510? Everything else below is should.
So the other thing that we talked about previously, to jump in here too, is regarding footnotes. Footnote 67 here was pretty important for that same line, because footnote 67 then makes that delineation, right? We consider the term gender in this regulation to mean sex.
Yeah.
Or you could just use that word for one and you don't need a footnote. But we did talk previously, when you're talking about inclusion and the demographics and some of that information that you should be collecting at that granular level, is like that sexual orientation and gender identity as well.
So
it's relevant.
This is definitely a different voice. And what I interpret with this is they do delineate very clearly in this one paragraph what is required by statutory levels and what is a recommendation. And they must submit something to the IND. So there's your regulation. You must have it in the IND. That's probably going to be part of the congressional report that FDA sends. But then everything else is should, including but not limited to how to mitigate such an outcome in the event that enrollment goals are not met. So in other words, we have to report this, but there's really no teeth behind it. You don't really have to do anything about it. We just have to show that we reported it. That's how I interpreted it. And honestly, after I read this paragraph, I was very disappointed because the voice from the past 5 sections were much different. We thought this was a progressive change. We thought people were on board. We thought all of this, but then whoever wrote this procedure section kind of alluded to telling the sponsors what they actually have to do and what they don't, which from my experience, from the history of the industry, means that we're not going to get anywhere.
Right.
We talked about the fluidity of this document, right? we've already gotten to the point where we know and acknowledge that the DAP should be something that you can change and modify and adjust. And what we talked about in our perspective, you should be changing that. If you are not meeting your goals, you should make changes to what those initiatives look like. You should make changes to how you're trying to meet those goals. But this bullet point alone, exactly, Fox. I mean, it's just like, all right, all you have to do, and that's what we talked about initially, is saying all you have to do is just say, here was our DAP. We didn't meet it. Here's why we think we didn't meet it.
And FDA is like, okay, check a box. We told Congress about it.
Right. And at the last bullet point, before we jump into devices, more specifically within the lines 522, 523, I personally found it very, very disturbing when they say, that the sponsor should provide an explanation of what measures may have contributed to the observed outcomes with
They didn't have transportation, Mitch.
to the enrollment goals. Now they're asking the sponsor to explain a bias in a study, okay?
Yeah.
And as such, with these biases, the results cannot and could not and will not be generalizable. Hence, there is no external validity. So it's not only a weakness, but it's a threat.
So that right there, if you want to say, why didn't we enroll patients? That is not something a sponsor can answer. So that maybe they'll have to do surveys to sites, interview sites, understand what happened. But even then, you can report all you want. There's no teeth behind this. This is just another box to check.
It's asking for a hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Sponsors might say what they think is happening with patients. Maybe they can go interview some patients, but then again, that's something sites need to do.
The other funny thing about that too is, I mean, depending on what point in your trial you're hitting this, is like, well, if you identified these as a potential barrier or problem that you were observing through the life of the study, why didn't you change it?
Mm-hmm. I do want to. So this will be relevant to the other one too. Hadi, was that was it for drugs?
Yes.
Okay. Mitch, did you have anything additional for drugs?
Yeah, kind of just more like the aspect of like not having footnotes or references or citing other documents. In 504, that bullet point of 504. The status of the diversity action plan submissions, and as appropriate, any discussions and correspondence with FDA regarding the DAP, including with respect to partial waiver request or granted, should be included in the regulatory history. So it's like telling you right there, bring all these additional documents.
Yeah, by the way, have this in there. And for the FDA intern who's drafting this guidance, you need to make a space there. That's driving me crazy. Okay, so the only other thing that I thought might really be pertinent, because a lot of this is doc control stuff, red lines, I get it. It's typical. But this section here, 480 to 488, it makes it seem pretty comprehensive. But do you remember the past two sections, sections 5 and I think 4? Or is just section 5? There's no indication on this bullet point how sponsors are supposed to delineate those one DAP for many trials. If you're going to have a DAP for multiple trial applications, how are you going to denote that in your application? What are you going to do? Are you going to reference a previously approved DAP? How is this going to happen? Because there's much more of a delineation in the past section than initial and revised. You might actually have unapproved.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was.
I mean, depending on your pipeline and what you know for your multiple studies that you have planned, right, as a sponsor, because it's the same. We're talking about the same drug essentially at that point. So if you have that same drug being marketed or being studied to potentially be marketed across multiple therapeutic areas, or for the same therapeutic area but for different specificities of use. When in this process, like, do you have to submit this DAP for the first phase 3 of this program, right? when does that timeline hit? Because it's not specific enough, I think, when it talks about, yep, you need to submit it by phase 3, right, with your IND. Well, if you have a whole program, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, it's still not clear, and maybe this guidance will have a couple versions coming out, but I don't see how this guidance has the guidance, so to speak, for the sponsors to adequately exercise diversity action plans. And that's kind of concerning, because not only is this late, and not only is this supposed to be in effect, in like 6 months, whatever it might be, but there's still a lot of questions to be had. Maybe so many people will answer, ask questions. FDA can do that and delay it by another year. But
I feel like they had a typo at 480 anyways. I mean,
480?
I was really confused by that when I read through it multiple times. Yeah. That section we were just in, as a cover letter accompanying a diversity action plan submission should alert FDA that the submission includes a diversity action plan. I think they mean an IND, right? A cover letter accompanying an IND should alert that there is a diversity action plan with that submission.
So hey, it should. It doesn't have to, right?
Also should. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that just didn't really make sense. Like, if you're submitting a diversity action plan, you should have a cover letter that says it's a diversity action plan. Like, I mean,
that makes sense. Like, I can send a cover letter with my resume. Be like, hey, I'm interested in this. By the way, my resume is attached.
I suppose.
So, I mean...
But you're submitting these in the ECTD system, right? Like, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody what's being submitted here. So I don't know. I digress.
All right. Well, we're at 46 minutes, everyone. I don't think devices are going to take that long, because honestly, there's a lot of duplicity. But did you have any comments on the devices section, Hadi?
Again, may. I mean, there's a lot of
may or may not.
May. And
there's no definition of may, is there? Or maybe there was. I'll have to go back. I mean,
yeah, that was actually mentioned earlier on. But again, the use of word may, I mean, it's like so up in the air. So on line 541, I highlighted something here, is that studies not requiring submission of an IDE application may be developed without FDA's input. I mean,
that was listed a couple times.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, line 544, a sponsor may opt to request. It's like may opt.
Yeah. So we have. Actually, just real quick, Hadi, because this is a community forum. So, Tiana, anyone see clarity on biosimilars? Yes, Tiana. Previous section. Do we remember which one it was? That's when a DAP is not required, right? That was section 3? Section 3. If you check out section 3, it's super short. It says when a DAP is required, biosimilars are in there. Apparently, with biosimilars, DAPs are not required, according to the FDA draft guidance.
I think they might have encouraged them, but yeah, it was pretty clear that biosimilars were not included in the requirements.
But yeah, I agree, Hadi. And this is my biggest gripe about devices. Said it before. I still don't know when it should and should not happen, and it's really weird because sometimes it's like FDA's, yeah, we're here for you anytime, and other times FDA's like, yeah, don't bother, we don't want to see it. Or you may not need agency input or whatever it might be. So at this point, the way devices are covered, I almost would recommend FDA carve this out into its own guidance, because I think it needs more clarity. And I think Mitch kind of alluded to it in one of the other episodes, but adding devices to this kind of convoluence, it really muddies up the water for drugs.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not an expert on devices. I will say that again and again. But on line 583, it says, if the sponsor considers FDA's feedback on the modification to be necessary to guide product development and or submission preparation, the sponsor should submit a pre-submission. So it's kind of confusing.
They don't have to.
Right. I mean, if the sponsor considers, like,
Yeah.
if you consider, then you should. But it's
Mhm.
up to the sponsor, right?
And look at the next sentence. FDA anticipates that most modifications to a DAP for studies that do not require an IDE will not need feedback from the agency. It's like, okay.
You know what? I still really have a hard time reading these, under the device section.
Mhm.
For some reason, it's not getting through my head. So
Well, and I've done devices as an administrator. I haven't filed with the FDA for devices, but I feel like it could get a little more clear. Give me a process map or something, a table, something, because this back and forth, yes, no thing is a little odd. So, Mitch,
So considering again, these were all about the submission guidelines, like how you submit these, what the expectations are. 548 was to the point I was making with the drugs and how it seemed like it was a typo when submitting diversity action plans.
there you go.
548 says the cover letter accompanying a submission that includes a diversity action plan, examples, an IDE application, marketing submission, or Q submission. So like kind of right there, that's a great section. Like that's how the drug one should have kind of been written. But I do feel that both of these in general, kind of like we talked about having multiple authors, this one seemed to be another one of these. Like someone wrote drugs, someone wrote devices, because you have someone who knows their drugs, someone who knows their devices. And there were some of these key differences where I actually feel that the device section was a little bit stronger. So the last bullet point of both sections, it's 518 for drugs and 617 for devices. But for drugs, one of these comparators, it's in marketing application submissions, sponsors should provide a brief overview of the diversity action plan pertaining to, phase 3 or other pivotal studies. And then when you get down to how that's spelled out for devices down at 617, in circumstances where diversity action plan is required to support marketing authorization, the FDA recommends that sponsors provide a clear and concise description of the diversity action plan for inclusion of the public-facing summary documents. That just sounds,
I had the same. That was the one thing I noted, and it might be where you were coming from. I didn't even realize it might be different authors, but I was sitting here thinking, with all the detail in the devices section, I wish some of this detail was in the drug section, and the public-facing summary documents was one of them. Will there be public-facing summary documents for drugs? And maybe that's the BLA. I don't know. I'd have to look into that, but you can definitely tell a difference in voice between devices and drugs.
Sure. Yeah. Brief overview versus clear and concise description is it strikes me as very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're at 53 minutes. Do we have any other comments?
No, that was pretty much it for me for these sections.
Yeah, same here.
So again, when it comes to guidance, and especially for this guidance, pay very close attention to the terms statutory, must, and should, because that's reading between the lines. What are sponsors required to do by statutory mandates versus what's a recommendation that they have to do? And I can tell you right now, there are sponsors who are literally trying to identify how little they can do to support DEI. I'm hopeful that sections 8 and 9 might apply a little more motivation for sponsors. But at the end of section 6 and 7, I'm very, heartbroken, disappointed. There's a lot of energy behind this, and I think section 7 kind of just ruined it.
Yeah. We did include in the PDF for these sections, because it seemed to be a little bit more pertinent here. We included the appendices, Appendix 1 in here. I don't have any specific comments, that weren't already addressed, because it's mostly just kind of copy and paste and referencing things that they're expecting in here with just an abundance of footnotes, footnotes referencing other footnotes. But
it's interesting they have a version number and date. So I get doc control, but that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's its own little protocol.
Yep.
Hey, ethnicity is in the recommendation, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, for the enrollment goals,
Mhm.
right?
Yep. But yeah, there's a big difference between rationale and consequence, or rationale, outcome, and consequence.
I think the oldest reference, though, too, because I know we have fun with that sometimes, was actually footnote 80 again when sex came up, because I was like, oh, I wonder what they're going to say in here, because previously it was when talking about gender, we specifically mean sex. But then again, they're using sex here where they used gender previously, and then had a footnote that said by gender we mean sex. But footnote 80, the guidance for industry study of sex differences in the clinical evaluation of drugs was from July 93.
Wow.
Nice.
How many decades? Literally.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I think that was the oldest reference I think we've seen yet.
And some references never die. That's great, but are there better ones since then? And they referenced 2014, so kudos to them. They had a couple of them, but that's still a decade ago. A lot's changed.
We've got studies in support of special populations for geriatrics, which was 94.
Ironically, an old reference for geriatrics.
That's what I was thinking too. I kind of chuckled at that myself. I was like, oh yeah.
All right.
But yeah, I think they're just creating those kind of those inherent weaknesses or threats when you have references to document. You're coming out with new innovative guidance, but you're still referencing stuff that's 20 to 21 years old. Like this is old enough to drink alcohol. You know what I mean? Like I can take this reference to a bar for this guidance material. Like that seems a little old. Like maybe.
So then how relevant would your brand new guidance be if you use a bunch of old references?
Yeah, exactly. Make it more clear in this document instead of having to reference stuff that's 21 years old. But no, I digress. Thank you everyone for coming on. Again, the PDF links are in YouTube and on LinkedIn. If you have comments, you want to drop some comments in here of your own, feel free to add them at any time. We'll pull them up before we have to submit our comments and feedback to the FDA. Other than that, thank you all for joining. We'll see you for SWAT next week. And what sections are we doing next week?
We're gonna be wrapping up the guidance with 8 and 9 next week. Get ready. The invite's out there. Read the sections, have your comments ready. But don't forget, that's not the end. We've got summary and final. Summary, we're going to wrap it all up, get final comments, and final, we are going to present to you our letter to the FDA and show you how to submit it.
And we have, I believe, multiple guests planned to come on for the next couple of weeks. So it should be fun, a little more engaging.
We're looking forward to that. Thank you.
All right. Big hearts, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Take care.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.